Welcome to the Workology Podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader. Join host Jessica Miller-Merrill, founder of Workology.com, as she sits down and gets to the bottom of trends, tools, and case studies for the business leader, HR, and recruiting professional who is tired of the status quo. Now here's Jessica with this episode of Workology.
As a society, we have grown up with the use of certain pronouns to use that refer to a person based on male or female and using a singular or plural framework. However, this is changing, and a growing number of individuals are asking to be referred to not in the traditional way in which we've grown up with, but in a way that lacks gender identity. Chances are, in your role in HR or as a business leader, you will have or will be encountering a situation where an employee, candidate, or someone you know requests to be referred to in a specific way. Today, we're talking about inclusion and the use of gender-neutral pronouns in the workplace. A special thank you to Clear Company as the sponsor of the Workology podcast. Today, I'm joined by Christine Assef. She's a seasoned HR professional who currently hangs her hat at Waste Management. Christine, welcome to the Workology podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Talk to us a little bit about your background. How did you get to where you are working in human resources?
Yeah, so I'm kind of one of those weird ones that didn't go into human resources immediately. I started off actually in theater and quickly changed my mind to business management because I wanted to make money. And after a few management stints here and there with different places, it was either a decision of going into accounting or going into HR. And so I took the lesser of two evils. I've worked in a few small businesses here and there and a couple of big ones. And I currently just ended up at Waste Management, and I've been here for about 6 years as an HR generalist for the Gulf Coast market area. I'm certified as a leadership development trainer, and I'm currently in grad school for industrial and organizational psychology. So that's fun. And in my spare time, I'm involved in a nonprofit that follows local politics and advocacy.
Awesome. Well, I can't believe you worked at Waste Management for 6 years. I feel like you just started.
Yeah, I actually feel like I've been there much longer because Waste Management is a very fast-paced, although wonderful company to work for. But yeah, it's been a very interesting HR experience because the type of work that I do, I live in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, but I work remotely mostly for about 14 or 15 different sites. And so I very frequently am, on the telephone, talking via email, and then occasionally doing site visits when I can. So it keeps me on my toes. It's a lot of, one day I'll be doing this, the next day I'll be doing that. And that's kind of how I like it. And a lot of being able to coach and develop mid-level managers. So I do a lot of kind of employee relation, employee investigation, and coaching and development. So it's really nice. And
you have written on the blog in the past, so I'll probably link to maybe a couple of your old posts in the transcript of the podcast if people want to check out some things that you've written.
That'd be great.
So the topic that we're talking about today is an extremely important one. It's not one that I think I've heard on any HR podcast, which is why I was excited for us to kind of start the conversation here. But it's also really important for HR and recruiting leaders to think about promoting inclusiveness. So I think that's a lot of our job these days, and respect in the workplace. So today we're talking about the use of gender-neutral pronouns. So first, before we kind of get into this, can you first talk to us about the difference between a gender-neutral pronoun and one that is a gender pronoun?
Right. So a gender pronoun is things like he, him, she, her. So for myself, I refer to my own pronouns as she and her. So when someone is saying, Christine wants to go to that restaurant, she really likes it, they would use the she pronoun to replace my proper name noun. But gender neutral pronouns tend to be other things. The most common used gender neutral pronoun is they and them. But in some cases, we've seen there's other ones out there like they and them and here and fey. They're not very common, I guess, where I'm at, down in the South. they and them is pretty common for the gender neutral pronoun, but they are starting to kind of get reintroduced. And it's worth noting also that these gender pronouns, when we talk about gender pronouns, we tend to think about the actual pronouns themselves, like she, him, he, and they, them. But it's also important to take into account things like being able to say, instead of husband and wife or boyfriend and girlfriend, spouse or partner, or instead of saying, daughter or son, saying child, things that end up being a little bit more neutral and don't create a gender when you're talking about someone.
Good. Thank you for that background. So let's talk about why people would want to use gender neutral pronouns.
Right. Well, so, why a person would want to use it is their personal preference. And so when a person requests it, you really just kind of have to use it. Some people do not think of themselves as either male or female. They think of themselves actually as on a spectrum of that. Maybe they don't consider themselves to be male or female at all, or maybe they feel that they consider themselves to be a third type of gender identity. And so that's why they would use these pronouns. So it's no different than when I guess somebody would request a nickname or a name change. They would basically say, "Hey, I want to be called this from now on. Can you do that?" And so that's why they want to they want to do that. So it seems like that requesting it is weird because, especially with they, them, it feels like it's plural. And so it feels like, well, why would we use they, them when they, them is only used for plural? But we actually kind of use it all the time in talking about a gender of a person. So, for example, if you were to ask somebody, "Hey, did the mail carrier come by today and drop off the mail?" And they would say, "Yes, they did," right? And the reason we use that they there is because we don't know the gender of the person that we're referring to. So we use they. But we know that not 5 mail carriers came. We know that just one did. And so, but we still use that as a singular. So it's important to note that even though it seems like maybe sometimes gender neutral pronouns, especially they, them, seem plural, you can use them in the singular. And it also, in a lot of other cultures and languages, there are many cultures that do take into account the spectrum of gender. I know Native American cultures talk about two-spirit, where there's not necessarily male and female, but there's also people who express themselves as two spirits. So this is not necessarily something that is new. This is not necessarily something that is a fad. This is something that's kind of existed in humanity as long as humanity has been around. And so why people would want to use those gender pronouns is simply their personal preference, as well as how they feel. And it's just something that I think we all need to, learn.
Well, and that's why I'm excited that we're talking about this today and you're able to share. I do think that as HR and workplace leaders, we are going to see more employees asking to be referred to as they, them, and in a more gender neutral kind of way. So I wanted to ask you, how should we handle this? And how should we refer to someone maybe who doesn't want to be referred to as he or she in the workplace?
Right. Well, the answer really is very simple, which is we need to just use whatever it is that they want. Once it's requested, it pretty much becomes okay, now how should we implement it? So usually, and it depends on where this person is in the company, whether they're a candidate or an actual employee. But usually they're going to indicate to you what they prefer their pronouns to be. In some cases, you might meet them and you might use a pronoun that is either a male pronoun or a female pronoun, and they might correct you and say, "Oh, it's they, please." And if that's the case, then you just shift your language to using that preferred pronoun from there on. And then it's up to us to kind of monitor the workplace and the language and to practice using those, especially when we're not used to it. So, most of us are all used to the he and she pronouns, and we tend to see people in that specific gender role. But in these particular cases, once someone requests the gender neutral pronouns, it's going to take practice. So the biggest part of this is to communicate. And I think that when an employee comes to us and says, "Hey, these are the pronouns I want to have used," the biggest thing is going to be understanding and thanking them for letting you know. But then going forward is, okay, how would you like me to communicate this to the company and to your manager and to everybody else? And that's going to be real key because in these particular situations, especially when we're dealing with a more normative behavior that tends to lean towards more heterosexuality and common gender identity of male and female, people tend to not understand it. And so being able to communicate to them, how would you like me to help you facilitate this process, is going to be real important. In some cases, they might want to do it themselves. And in some cases, they might not. In some cases, they might say, hey, I'd appreciate it if you would go talk to the manager. I'd appreciate it if you would go talk to the team. Or maybe some kind of combination thereof. So it's really important to take into account what their wishes are, how they would like to be able to communicate that to the group, and allow them the ability to kind of let that marinate too. In some cases, they might come to you and say, hey, this is what I want going forward. And you have to say, okay, well, taking that into account, we got to let everybody else know, here's the options. So asking how you can help facilitate that, or if they don't want it at all, is going to really be the preference there.
This is all great. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the biggest thing is, and the thing that needs to happen mostly on the front end is acceptance. They have to know that you say, that's great. I appreciate you letting me know. Now let's talk about how we're going to make it happen for you. That's really what they need to hear, and they need to know that they have that support.
Let's take a reset. This is Jessica Miller Merrill, and you're listening to the Workology podcast. Today we're talking with Christina Seff on creating an inclusive workplace using gender-neutral pronouns. A special thank you to our podcast sponsor, Clear Company.
This podcast is sponsored by Clear Company, the fastest growing talent management system on the market, and recently won G2 Crowd's #1 user recommended Winter 2018 award. Visit clearcompany.com to learn more.
Christine, I think you've given us a lot of good food for thought and some good nuggets here, but let's talk about what the process is. So an employee comes and they say, hey, I want to be referred to differently. How does HR handle this, and what should we be doing?
Right. So I think the first thing is, especially depending on where they are, like I said before, in the process, whether they're a candidate or employee, it's going to be super important that we respond very quickly, especially when it's a candidate, because we don't want to scare them away or we don't want to offend them. And so we want to make sure that if they come in today and they want this to happen immediately, well, we're going to have to work on it immediately, because that can potentially be something that can lose you a really great talent. Second, I think that approaching the manager at first is really going to be the key there, and instructing and educating them and getting their buy-in on it. And hopefully we've already had some pre-training inclusion training that the manager, is already comfortable with the idea. And then I think that, as with anything, anytime you're doing anything with a group or a team, getting that manager to tell you, how do you feel like would be the best way to deliver this to your people, to your area, to your team, because they're going to know what the best way is to relay that information, and they're going to know whether or not we can foresee any particular issues with that group or team there. So because, most frontline managers, they know their employees better than HR really does, because they're working with them day to day. And, again, emphasizing to the entire team that this is a sensitive issue and that they need to have a very welcoming perspective when they go forward with this, but also emphasizing to the team to not make this a very big, huge, laborious issue. Some of the big things that I find that happens with this transition is that people tend to want to make it a really big deal and want to talk about it a whole lot, or want to make their mistakes a really, really big deal. And the problem is that can kind of make that person feel uncomfortable. So mistakes is something that I really think that we need to talk about a lot when we're going through any kind of training on the team about this change happening. Letting everybody know that you're going to mess up. You've been calling this person this particular way for a really long time. Now you're going to be calling them this way now. And so it's going to be difficult to break that habit, but it's important that you just practice. And it's important that when you mess up, you just correct yourself. Or if you mess up and you get corrected, that you don't make it this big deal, that you just kind of go, oops, and you correct yourself and you move on. So doing examples and having mock conversations, showing how you can mess up and how to recover from that in a very simple, easy kind of conversation flow way is a really great way to make the staff feel reassured, and then also the person reassured that everybody's kind of working towards the goal of getting to a sense of normal.
One of the things I want to point out, and I think you covered this, but when we're talking about the inclusive candidate experience, which I've written about quite a bit, more for other groups like people who have disabilities, making the hiring process inclusive. This is another area where somebody comes in and they say, hey, I want to be referred to as this. That's part of the inclusive work environment and being inclusive in the interview. I do think that having those conversations with your managers, hiring managers that are going to be doing the interviewing, and just kind of preparing them for when that conversation happens is going to make it, like you said, it's not a big deal. Like, hey, no problem. And then they just move on.
Well, and I think that it even starts even before then. It starts really at the recruitment process when we're pasting a job posting or on our applications. Do we, on our applications, do we have salutations that are Mr. and Mrs. and we don't have anything else? Do we ask what are your preferred pronouns on the application? On the job posting, are we asking, what your preferred pronouns are? Or another great thing that I love that companies do is whenever they have about us pages on their websites, they will have everybody put their preferred pronouns on there. And that's an indication to someone who is either gender neutral or gender, whatever gender identity, that, hey, that this place seems to be an inclusive place, because they're aware of that. They're aware of pronoun usage, and that pronoun usage is talked about. And so those are the kind of things that can really indicate to anybody who's kind of in that spectrum, that gender identity spectrum, that, hey, this looks like a place that I could be, because they're going to understand my usage of those pronouns.
And I hadn't thought of it the way that you're describing, to do that on the career site specifically, because I think of job descriptions and there are technologies and tools that will help make those more gender neutral, but being really intentional on the career site beyond the job postings, I think really sends a message to your candidate that you are inclusive.
Yeah, actually, it's funny that you mentioned that, because my college kid is currently looking for a job right now for an internship over the summer, and one of the things that we found, I think my husband actually found it, was a job posting for Bumble, the dating app, and they were looking for writers for the dating app. But at the very, very top, it said that they preferred a member of the LGBT community, and in that exact post, they requested that it was a person who, had preferred gender pronoun usage that was not of their, other preferred pronouns, and I forget how it was said, but it was said in such a way that it really indicated to anybody who was on that, who takes into account that gender identity, pronoun usage, that hey, this is a good place to work, and that's what they're looking for.
Maybe we can find that posting and put that in the resources section on the podcast transcript, because I think some examples would be really helpful to listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to try to find it.
Awesome. If not, I'll dig for it as well. So one of my biggest concerns as you're talking here, and I'm thinking that the listeners are thinking the same thing, is respecting the employee's request, which I feel like most HR professionals, they are on it. But I think my biggest concern would be the managers, who maybe don't understand why this is important. So what type of training and or conversations do you recommend that we should be having with those managers, whether they're frontline or maybe senior level in the organization?
Yeah, I think preemptively, this definitely has to be something that's included or covered in inclusion trainings that the company either currently offers or will offer in the future. Make it as part of something that is just at the core of what you do when we talk about inclusivity. And the big thing to hit home in those trainings is that we live in a very heteronormative society. And so we've got to be able to indicate to managers and senior leadership and everyone that there's going to be people that are different from us. They seem different, but it's not different. We're just all have our own things. And so I think thereafter, what we have to indicate to managers is that it's really all a part of our jobs to make everybody feel comfortable at the workplace, And it's all part of our jobs to make people feel like they're included and not considered different or weird in the workplace. And so not making a big deal out of it can also kind of be part of the training. And if a person doesn't feel like they can be themselves at the workplace and they feel like it's not that their gender identity is not being honored, that can be a big problem, right? You're going to turn into having some workplace issues and animosity and hostility. And then one of the things that I wanted to point out is that under EEOC guidelines, with the guidelines that they have for Title VII, the protected class of sex has been expanded to include gender identity. So there's that, right? And now, while it's not a federal law, it is covered under the EEOC, and EEOC does actually look at those claims. So if you have someone who does have gender neutral pronouns that are chosen, and you have a manager who is specifically choosing not to use those because maybe they don't believe in it or for whatever reason, problem is that can become a workplace liability. So we got to be careful there. But beyond that, it's really just the right thing to do. A manager who isn't on board with that can also probably be a manager who's just not really good with culture and environment in their own area. And so most managers who aren't willing to include everyone and willing to make those changes, that's probably an indicator that they're already a problem to begin with.
Can you talk a little bit about why this is so important for you?
Right. Yeah. So I mentioned earlier that my college kid was looking for a job. My college-age child just recently started using a gender-neutral name as well as gender-neutral pronouns, and we have communicated for a very long time with my kid that and lots of different talks about their feelings on things. And I think there was always been a situation that we knew was going to be coming, but we were waiting for them to kind of do it when they were comfortable. And I think when college kind of hit and it was an opportunity for my kid to be in a new place, to be able to use new pronouns in a new place, which as an aside, let's take that into account. Someone might move a job and decide at that new job that they're going to use different pronouns there. And so that can be something to take into account, is that, you're looking at a driver's license and it says one thing, or you're filling out forms and something, insurance forms, and it says a different gender, but then you realize they requested gender neutral pronouns. And for some of us, it can be like a cognitive dissonance, right? We look at that and we go, that doesn't make sense to us. But that's because we ourselves, most of us at least, are what we consider cisgender, the gender that we were born with, as well as heterosexual. And so we're not used to that type of difference. And so I guess what I want to point out is that people sometimes change jobs to be able to align with their new chosen pronouns and their new chosen gender identity. And so that can sometimes be something that we need to take into account. And HR needs to be very careful on the privacy of that, making sure that, while a person is choosing and saying what their gender identity is going to be, or gender identity is, and what the pronouns that they prefer are, that we're not also outing them in any kind of way or making any big deals about things. But anyway, to go back to the story. So for a while, we knew that my kid was going to be doing this, and my kid decided to do it in a mass email to all the family. They're a writer, and that's what they're going to school for, is to be a writer. And so I think for them, it made sense to write down everything that they felt, and to answer any of the questions preemptively to the family, because most of my family is cisgender, the gender that they have at birth, and so they really don't understand. Anyway, but it was well received by everybody, and what was really great was that my kid did it right before Christmas time, and so we all had time to practice on it, and the whole family had time to kind of adjust and got pretty used to switching the pronouns. Now, I can't say that we're 100% all the time, and I can't say that I've never made a mistake or that any of us have not made a mistake, but we're all very used to kind of course correcting in the conversation and just moving forward with it. And we've gotten very used to slowing down when we talk so that we can make sure we're using our words carefully. And it does take practice, but you get used to it. I also will say that I use my kids' proper name more in conversation, and this is something that's probably good in the practice that you do with your employees as well. Is the they can sometimes get confusing, especially if you're also talking about another collective group. So if you're using two theys in the course of a sentence, it can get confusing. So sometimes inserting a proper noun and using that person's name can sometimes help with confusion, and especially when the listener is a little bit confused about which pronoun you're using there.
One of the things that I've noticed in researching this topic and thinking about how we wanted to have this podcast with you and this interview is that there seem to be a lot of assumptions that these type of general gender neutral requests are just for transgender and members of the LGBT community. Can you talk about that? Is that something that you're seeing too?
Right. And, and even in the course of this conversation, I talked about, heteronormative, which is, kind of the thing. And I won't begin to be able to collectively call any particular group. And I am not a member of the LGBT community, so I don't want to speak on behalf of them. But what I will say is this, is that gender is one thing and sexual orientation is a completely other thing. And in fact, one of the great things that I heard a friend of mine say is gender is what's in my head and sexuality is what's in my bed. And so I loved that example. So just because somebody uses gender neutral pronouns doesn't necessarily mean that that person is considered transgender or gay or lesbian or bisexual or asexual, any of those things. In fact, most of the time, and not all the time, but most of the time, they consider themselves to be non-binary, meaning they don't consider themselves to be male or female at all. And so it's just their preferred way of being talked to and about. And there's lots of different classifications out there, and I'm sure we're going to provide some of those resources, but there's so many classifications out there, and you can get bogged down on whether or not they're a he or a she or they're a they, and does that mean that they're male or female or non-binary or, all these different things. And really what it just comes down to is just honoring their preference and less about the category. But it's okay to ask about what pronouns they prefer. And in fact, that's probably one of the best things you can possibly do for a person like that you're not sure whether or not they are in either a transgender community or a non-binary community or anything that's kind of under that LGBTQ umbrella. Asking them, hey, what is your preferred pronoun? Trust me, I promise you that I've had plenty of people that I'll just stop in mid-conversation right before I'm about to use a pronoun and I'll say, oh, I'm sorry, what's your preferred pronoun? And they really do appreciate it when you do that, because if you're not sure, they just rather you ask. Now, as far as the other side of things, sexual orientation, well, that's never really appropriate to ask someone, are you gay or are you bisexual? And especially in the workplace. So, I mean, we wouldn't want anybody to ask us that personally. So we definitely don't want that in the workplace. So I wouldn't ever make any assumptions. Don't make any assumptions that just because a person decides to use gender neutral pronouns, that means they're either gay or bisexual or whatever. It just means that they should prefer to use gender neutral pronouns. And so that's really just, just that's what it is.
Thank you. I just think that people make a lot of assumptions like you're saying. And also as HR leaders, I think we need to be prepared when we're building our inclusion training that people are going to make assumptions and to remind them not to make assumptions.
Right.
Do you have any advice on suggested resources or places that HR leaders can go to get more information?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned before the whole idea of two spirits. PBS has a great map that shows all of the gender diverse cultures around the world and their languages, and it even goes into the history of them. It's really interesting. If you Google PBS gender diverse cultures around the world, you'll find it, and you're able to click on all these different places to find out how globally the idea of gender neutral pronouns and gender diversity has always existed. Also, genderspectrum.org is a good resource, as well as transstudent.org. They have a lot of different things where you can kind of educate yourself on all the different categories and all the different types of pronouns that are out there. And you can kind of get lost in a whole lot of just reading about all these different specifications, which is really neat. And then also Bill Nye, the science guy, has a really great piece on YouTube about sexuality and gender spectrum. If you just Google Bill Nye and gender spectrum, you're going to find it. It's really great. It's like 5 minutes, 6 minutes long. And so it's something that you can always kind of show to your people if you feel like it's appropriate. And it's a good way to kind of everybody to crowd around Bill Nye. Everybody loves Bill Nye. And then if you're more into like sciencey things and you want some more like facts and statistics and things like that, or you just want to read more, National Geographic has an article called How Science Helps Us to Understand Gender Identity. And Scientific American has an article called The New Science of Sex and Gender. And both of those are excellent because they really kind of go into the science of gender and why gender diversity and non-binary gender people have kind of always been part of humanity and part of, the animal kingdom. There's also this really, really great program. My family really loved this, as well as I think it's just a great tool to be able to provide for your employees and your managers. It's a game by Minus 18. And if you just Google Minus 18, the word minus 1818 pronouns, you'll find it. And basically, it's a little game where you choose which pronouns you need to use, and then it gives you sentences, and you have to replace the pronouns with the correct pronouns. So it's a great way to train yourself on thinking that way. So when you're referring to someone who you think is a he or a she, and then now you need to refer to them as a them and they, it's a great way for you to be able to kind of insert that. So my family used that a lot, and they really enjoyed that tool before, when my kid decided that was the pronouns that they wanted everyone to use. And so it was real helpful.
Awesome. We'll link to all these things that you just mentioned, and I think I'll probably go ahead and embed Bill Nye's YouTube video into the transcript. So if you just go to workology.com and put in the search bar gender neutral pronouns, you'll be able to find this episode with all the resources if you don't happen upon it, on the front page. Christine, thank you so much for talking with us. I've learned a lot. I know that you're helping so many people and so many workplaces be more inclusive and respectful, and just being able to work better together and live together, because that's what we're here to do. Where can people go to learn more about you?
Right. So I guess I have a LinkedIn page that you can go to if you want to learn more about me there. I still have a blog, I think. It might be dusty. I might have to dust it off. But also people can feel free to email me if they want to, and I can provide that to you or whatnot. And if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Awesome. Well, this was so great. I mean, I am loving it, and I hope that others feel the same. So thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.
Are you an HR leader who's looking to upskill your HR game? Check out Workology's Learn, an on-demand learning platform anytime, anywhere for individuals and teams. Visit workology.com/learn. A special thank you to our podcast sponsor, Clear Company. I appreciate Christine's candid conversation, sharing her own experience working in HR, but also as a parent. I feel very strongly on this topic. I want every person to feel welcome and able to bring their own best self to work. I know you do too. And that starts with making our workplaces ones where people feel like they are included and respected. It also means, as HR professionals, that we need to help our leaders understand the ways in which we need to help make that happen. Thank you for joining the Workology podcast.
Production services for the Workology podcast with Jessica Miller Merrill provided by TotalPicture.com.